Hello and good afternoon. Thanks to all the ones who are attending. And I'm very happy to welcome Irene Pimentel at our talk. Glad to see you, Irene.
Glad to see you too. Thank you very much.
Last year, we met each other in autumn in Lisbon, and we sat at a very long table and had bacalhau together. And it was very close to the Tejo, a very nice place. I had the feeling that, well, the city was very calm at that time. And people seemed a bit wary about international tourists, people coming from other countries. How do you experience the atmosphere in the city at the moment?
At the moment, we are beginning to get out of the pandemic because we have already almost 50% of persons that are vaccinated. And the British tourists are beginning to come mostly in the south, in Algarve. For us, it's very important that the tourists come again. So I think we see the lights in the end of the tunnel. Mostly, I think in the beginning of August, we should have 70% of people with vaccines. So
that's very good to hear.
Yeah. So
do you also hear German in the streets now, since your German is quite good?
No, not so. I don't see still a lot of French people. Yes, some Spanish, and now the British. But I hope they are all coming, not because of the gentrifying, because that's our problem, but because we need tourists.
Yeah, Portugal also lives from tourism. Yeah,
exactly.
So you did your dissertation in institutional history and contemporary politics at the Universidade Nova in Lisboa. And now you are a researcher at the Institute of Contemporary History. I was wondering, like, when you walk through the streets of the city, sometimes you feel like reminded of the special events that happened there, like a long time ago, or for example, at the Largo do Calmo in the neighborhood of Chiado, which was a very important spot for the Carnation Revolution.
Exactly. The 25th of April, the most important thing that happened was there in Largo do Carmo, because the former prime minister, the dictator, one should say, of the dictatorship, resigned in that place to the military who made the coup d'etat. As you know, we had a coup d'etat, military, and afterwards, immediately in the same day, began a revolutionary, we can call it a revolution. The regime, the old regime was over, and we had a new page before us. In history, what happens a lot is that we had to make a lot of time until not only we discussed about what we want in the present and in the near future, but also to begin to make history of the dictatorship, because it was a regime that was over, and in history, when something is over, you can make history. But we had to do everything before, and that took a lot of time. We had to characterize the regime, and then came the institutions of the regime and so on.
Absolutely. But you not only wrote about the revolution and the Estado Novo, but also about the Second World War, the Secret Service later on in Portugal, and much more. And you got several prizes for it. It's very impressive. Where does that interest in historical events, like these unprecedented events from the past, come from?
Personally, it comes from my own life. It's always like that. I am a daughter or a child, a baby boomer. So I am the child from the Second World War. The Holocaust has influenced me a lot. My mother is Swiss. My father was a Portuguese. I am Portuguese, but I had a relationship with other countries. Mostly I was a little, I was cosmopolite. And I went in the French Lyceum of Lisbon because it was a lyceum where the dictatorship didn't put the ideology. So for me, it was very important, all of that, because I was in a country with a dictatorship, isolated from the rest of Europe. But at the same time, I had relationships with family in Switzerland, with education in the French Lyceum. And I think also my age, because of my age, I was 18 years old in the 68 May in Paris. I was I received a lot of influence. I went to Paris. I joined politics against the regime and against the colonial war. So when I began to do history, I wanted to understand what had happened also in my life, because I had a lot of false ideas, I thought, moved by ideology. And so I began to study the political police, because the political police of the dictatorship was the place we was most afraid.
Yeah. This is very interesting. We will speak about the witnesses of the past a little later. I would like to come to your recent book first, Zuflucht am Rande Europas, it's called in German. And it's about the Jews and other refugees, people fleeing from Nazi Germany and other European countries who came to Portugal to go overseas and flee. I was wondering, what was the stance of the Portuguese government at that time, because it was already an authoritarian regime at the time?
Exactly, an authoritarian regime with ties with Italian fascism and German national socialism. So those ties, the same anti-communist stance, the same anti-liberal, anti-parliamentary, but at the same time, that regime had some differences with the German regime. Most of it, the central point of it, was anti-Semitism. Biological anti-Semitism didn't exist in Portugal, in the government, in the dictatorship, and in the ideology of the Estado Novo. And that was important in order that Jewish refugees could save themselves through Portugal. But there were a lot of difficulties, because all the time it was very difficult to enter Portugal since 1938.
So when they were inside, it was okay, it was easier, and like the institutions put a blind eye on them.
Exactly.
But they had to come in at first.
Exactly. It was only a Transitland. They had to come, they could come if they had a visa, but they had to go very quickly abroad. They couldn't work in Portugal in order that they went abroad very rapidly. So it was not easy, but it was better to be, I say that, a Jewish refugee in Portugal than a political refugee. For instance, an anti-Nazi or socialist or communist refugee, because there, those were also the enemy of the Portuguese regime. And the question of Jewishes was not a question for the Portuguese regime. And most of the Jewish refugees were not political. So they wanted to be very quiet in the few months they stayed in Portugal.
And how many of them did manage to escape over Portugal in these years?
That's very difficult to know, because we don't find the sources of the political police, which was the international police. I should say it's not very accurate, from 60,000 to 80,000. When one studies those who came from France through Spain not by plane or not by a navy, or by the sea, one could say almost perhaps 80,000. But most of them came in the summer of 40. If Portugal in a moment had a lot of strangers, a lot of refugees, it was the summer of 40.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because the consul Aristides Mendes in Bordeaux disobeyed the orders of the visa of Salazar and gave visa to everybody who asked. So thousands of them came in that period.
I think I saw a film about that like some years ago in Lisbon, and there the position of the people, the normal people in the country, was also like shown in a heroical way. How would you see, like, what is your perspective on that, like individuals helping and putting their lives maybe at risk from a historical viewpoint?
Say that with the Portuguese dictatorship, the life was not in risk, but the profession, for instance, Aristides Mendes was punished and went out of the diplomatical career, and he died very poor because of that. So he was punished. Some of consuls of diplomats gave aid to refugees against the orders of Salazar, because they only could enter Portugal if they already had a visa for a third country, if they already had also the Navy ticket, and they showed they had money to stay in Portugal some months without...
It's a bit similar to the refugee situation now, isn't it?
Absolutely. You know, when I study, the last time I studied a train from Luxembourg with Jews from Luxembourg who couldn't enter the frontier, the Grenze in Portugal. And the train went back to France, occupied France, and 50 of those people died in the Holocaust. I thought a lot because it was in the period when I was doing that book, in the period where they spoke about the refugee crisis. Okay, I don't like the word crisis, but a lot of things were, for instance, the States didn't give entry visa because they were afraid that a lot of spies, German spy, were among the refugees. The same was in the last so-called crisis, because they were afraid those refugees among the refugees, they were terrorists from
it's interesting.
And a lot of things it's the same, you know, but of course with the differences of that period. But when I began to study that in the end of the 19th, I never thought that I would see exactly the same thing in Europe.
Yeah. So if we go a bit further in time now, when I remember, like, when I was living in Lisbon, there was a huge conference at the Gulbenkian Foundation about Jewish identity. And I was wondering, your viewpoint, how does the accounting of the past, how does it work in Portugal at the moment? Do you have the feeling that it gets bigger, that it's still a big issue? People are speaking about like how they can cope with the past, these old times, and also the Estado Novo, which was a very long, many decades.
You know, it's interesting because the dictatorship in Portugal lasted 48 years. And the next year, the democracy will be 48 years, okay? In the beginning of the democracy, already in the revolutionary process, there was a lot of studies, but more in the newspaper about the regime that was overthrown. But then, as always, the waves of memory changes with the time. In this moment, we have already the extreme right in the Parliament of Portugal. For the first time, one parliamentary, but he is going to win much more. But what I would like to say is that in the same time, we managed in the democracy to give a bad light to the dictatorship. That's my interpretation. Of course, now it's more indifference from the young people. We shall speak about that perhaps.
Yeah.
But even the right wing, even this extreme right wing, they have another agenda. They don't say we must have the Estado Novo again. We must have the political police censorship again.
So they don't dare to touch that subject.
Yes, that's important, okay? But of course, also with the generations, the several generations, it's very difficult nowadays that the young people gain interest. It's something European all over the world.
You also have this problem, like we have the same problem in Germany, of course. The witnesses of the past, they get older and older, and many of them have already passed away. So how do you judge like education in Portugal? How do they try to make it clear to the younger generation how what about that time?
For the first time, we have some museums, because for a lot of time we didn't have museums. We have a former prison, political prison, Aljube. It's a museum about the repression in the dictatorship. Another prison of Peniche is going to be a national museum. It's beginning to be important. We are going also, there is a lot of public opinion that wants to give a memory to the streets of Lisbon, to the places where something happened. That's important. But more important would be to give a new life to the teaching of history and philosophy. And that's the great problem, because for a lot of time in education, we had only mathematics, science, history, very little. At the same time, for instance, the Second World War and the Holocaust. You know that Portugal was neutral in the Second World War. And Salazar managed to keep the regime after 1945, and he could erase from the memory of the Portuguese that we were in Europe, that there were here some refugees, although Portugal was neutral. He managed to do that. So most of the people, when speaking about the Second World War and the Holocaust, say in Portugal, we have nothing to do with that. Now, for the first time in the last year, then came the pandemic, Portugal is in the International Holocaust Remembrance Association, as a full member. And there is a program of memory and history, which is called Never Forget, for the first time, exactly to remember and to make the history also what happened in Portugal about that, about the Holocaust.
And so are the young people still interested in this subject, or because you said something about ignorance also?
Yes.
Is there a general interest?
In this moment, I wouldn't say there is a general interest. There was
because of the pandemic.
Also because of that, and the schools were closed, but also a little before the pandemic. I go to a lot of secondary schools, and when I go there, people are very interested. And mostly because, you know, in Portugal, there are a lot of ethnicity. There are black students, there are gypsies, and so on and so on. And when one speaks about the Second World War, the Holocaust, racism, and so in history, they immediately make the coincidence with the reality today.
Yeah, it must be someone, a real person who tells them. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's, I think it's very important. There I see a lot. For instance, the same with the girls. when I speak about the situation of women, of their now grandmothers, they open their mouths because fortunately the situation is totally different. Already, also with inequalities, but the girls are very, very active, you understand, in that when they feel there's something to do. Of course, then they are the other persons who say, what interests the past? The past is the past. We are born today. And that idea of the present, you know, that everything has begun now with my life is very, very worldwide diffused. And
yeah, the contingency of history.
The contingency, what the French say, le présentisme, you see? And that's true, that's something we must fight against it.
Absolutely.
So the museums, the way the museums are made, not with a lot of things to read, you see? The way you compare what the atrocities in the past with the racism and xenophobia, the refugees crisis, that's very important, I think, today.
Okay. So unfortunately, I can only ask one more question because we're running out of time. I really wanted to know what you tell young people when they ask you or when you want to tell them about the day of the peaceful revolution, 25th of April, 1974, how you experienced that day.
Well, I experienced with my age, it was the best day of my life. Now, when I think about that day, of course, that day we were living it and it was not the best day. We didn't know where to go from here and what kind of coup d'etat it was. What I always say is, for women, for instance, there was a revolution. Of course, in the law first, not from below. It was like that, but it was very important to change the situation, and in order that we can change it more and better. And I say also, the best regime, I always say that, with all the imperfections, is democracy. Because in democracy, we can change things. Dictatorship, what I lived, a colonial war, where every young people had to go to fight the independent movements. Also, although you were against the colonial war, the political police, it was like something that made part of our lives when we were more active. And the censorship. The censorship was perhaps the most terrible in ignorance that the dictatorship brought to the Portuguese, because it brought a lie about the regime and the absence of alternatives. And that kind of things, I think we have now 48 years, because democracy is as strength, but we have new challenges: extreme right, racism, and xenophobia. I think the young people are very important because they are very against that, most of them, racism and xenophobia.
Okay, and it is very important to remember. And
exactly.
Give your own stance to it.
In what way, if we don't fight it in the egg, where it can go? That's very important to know that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Irene, for this very enlightening talk.
I liked very much. Thank you. I thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.